You know how many times users searched football on eBay.com last season? Try 12,000 per hour. That's because eBay has been the home of collectibles since 1995 with an unrivaled selection of trading cards and memorabilia. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Get busy building your collection today.
This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Playoff baseball is back. I'm Derek Van Riper, host of the Athletics Rates and Barrels podcast. Join Eno Saris,
Mr. Stats Guy,
Britt Chiroli,
how you like them apples,
Trevor May, and I as we dig deep into the key matchups and advanced stats driving the critical decisions throughout the postseason. From the first crack of the bat in the wild card round until the last pitch of the World Series, we have you covered. Check out the Rates and Barrels podcast every day during the postseason wherever you get your podcasts.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Matt Bishop and I'm joined as ever by my friend and co-host Richard Williams. And Richard, I'm very excited about today's episode.
Yes, this is one we've wanted to do for quite a while. It's the remarkable story of Niki Lauda's Monza comeback, just 40 days after the horrific F1 crash that nearly killed him. It was described at the time by no less a figure than Jackie Stewart as the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed in sport. And all these years later, the nature of the comeback remains unparalleled in sporting terms.
Yes, it absolutely does. And I think I agree with Jackie, and I'll explain why. Well, we'll both explain why. Because we're going to chronicle the story of how Niki Lauda crashed during the German Grand Prix of 1976 at the fearsome, and it was fearsome, Nurburgring Nordschleife, how he was engulfed in flames and how he sustained life-changing injuries and scarring that, being frank, Richard, might well have killed many other people.
Yes, indeed.
Including many other drivers. Anyway, that he not only survived but then went on to race successfully just 6 weeks later, while still afflicted by those injuries, both mental and physical, is, in my view, nothing short of astonishing, and even more so when viewed through a modern lens, as we'll discuss today.
Yeah, so perhaps we should start with a little background and context, because I'm sure there are younger listeners out there who'll remember Niki Lauda primarily as a senior management figure in the F1 paddock. He's the one who persuaded Lewis Hamilton to join what became the all-conquering Mercedes team of recent years, rather than as a driver himself.
Probably right, yes, probably. Yeah.
But he was a brilliant driver, a triple world champion, and possibly at his peak in 1976 when he was driving for Ferrari. You'll remember he'd had his first full season in 1972 when he was just 23, driving for March. And after switching to BRM for a second season in F1, he moved to Ferrari for 1974, at a point when they were right down in the dumps, as they occasionally are.
Well, had been. 74, They bounced back up, didn't
they were bouncing back up with him.
Yeah, exactly.
And he helped drive that revival to the extent that he won his first world title for them the following season. In 1976, as I said, he was at the height of his powers and looked odds-on for a second title. And leading up to the German Grand Prix on the Nürburgring, he'd won 5 of the 9 races to that date, finishing second twice and third once, with just 1 retirement. So he'd established a massive championship lead, 23 points, his 58 to James Hunt's 35. And that was in the days when you got 9 points for a win.
Yes, in old money, as we could put it.
So Niki was a talented, brave and ambitious driver, of course, but also a smart one on and off the track. He'd got into F1 in 1972 by defying the wishes of his grand Viennese family and borrowing £100,000 to get a drive with March, which turned out badly when the car was, in the term he always used, shit. You remember him saying that on many occasions. He borrowed another 80k to move to BRM for 1973, but when Big Lou Stanley, who ran BRM, saw how good he was, he offered him a proper salary, $30,000 a year, I think, in exchange for 2 more years on his contract.
Yeah.
And when Ferrari came calling at the end of 1973, he managed to get out that one and into the Italian team, where he was soon working very effectively with the chief designer, Mauro Forghieri, and the mechanics, all of whom worked to make the car competitive. And that gave him a great deal of confidence in his own ability and judgment.
Yeah. Niki was confident, but he was also incredibly plain-speaking and matter-of-fact about everything. If you asked him a question, he'd give you an honest answer. Not only honest, actually, but trenchant, too. He usually began his replies with, "It's very simple!" Then what followed was always both trenchant and honest. He used the word bullshit a lot. Actually, I think he was the originator of the word bullshit being such common parlance in Formula One as it still is. Anyway, he used the word bullshit.
That's because it's still full of bullshit.
It is full of bullshit. He used the word a lot, and he peppered his sentences with Lauda-isms, such as, and this is one example I remember, like you cannot believe. So, just going to give you a little example, and I apologise for my impersonations, but they amuse me, if no one else. So if you'd asked him, for example, how good was Carlos Reutemann? Obviously, you know, Richard, Carlos Reutemann was a childhood hero of mine, but Niki did not see it the same way. They were not friendly. Anyway, Niki would have replied something like this. It's very simple. Reutemann was full of bullshit like you cannot believe. Anyway, he was very honest, typically honest, and trenchant too, when voicing his opinions in the lead-up to the 1976 German Grand Prix. Oh, and by the way, if you'd argued with him about Reutemann or any other subject at all, he'd very often kick off his counter-argument with, "Are you nuts?"
I have to say, Matt, I think your Lauda impersonation is your pièce de résistance.
You haven't heard my Rosberg yet. Keke Rosberg, that is.
That'll come.
That'll come another time. Anyway, in the lead-up to the 1976 German Grand Prix, Niki suggested to his fellow drivers that they should boycott the race on safety grounds. In his own words, he considered the Nurburgring Nordschleife, the famous 14-mile, 23-kilometre green hell, as Jackie Stewart had christened it in the previous decade, to be from the Stone Age. He probably put a swear word in there as well, but he said it was from the Stone Age. In the end, his fellow drivers outvoted him. They voted him down because the organisers had committed to making improvements to the track. You know, stuff like installing barriers here and there, that kind of thing. But you have to remember, as I say, that it was a 14-mile lap, nearly 23 kilometres, and much of it was very fast, very bumpy, and therefore very dangerous.
And I think you have to put in there that there were 174 corners. That's sort of generally included in the description of the Nordschleife.
Absolutely. Uniquely.
174 corners. Not sure who counted them. I have to say.
No, but that's, I think, the subject, the number that's usually... I have heard 176.
Well, maybe they've found 2 more.
Even so, he was accused in some quarters of being a coward, despite the fact... And get this, despite the fact that in 1975, he'd become the first Formula One driver to post a green hell lap of less than 7 minutes when he put his Ferrari on the pole with a lap of 6 minutes 58.6 seconds, which was 1.4 seconds quicker than Carlos Pache, who had qualified his Brabham second. And they called him a coward, as I say, also, despite the fact, in first practice on Friday morning in 1976, the following year, the year we're going to be talking about, having just expressed the view that he was about to drive a Formula One car in anger around a death trap racetrack from the Stone Age, he posted the fastest time. more than 2 seconds quicker than anyone else's. And that's something I think we should never forget. And indeed, our chat is about to prove and probably reprove this repeatedly, I expect, Richard. Niki was not only trenchant and honest, as I say, but also very, very brave.
There were several things that influenced his thinking about the Nurburgring and F1 safety a bit more widely. 3 years earlier at the Dutch Grand Prix, this was in his second season in F1, he'd been deeply affected by the preventable death of the British driver Roger Williamson, who was burned to death in his car as helpless marshals just watched on.
And by the way, David Purley tried valiantly to save him.
To pull him out, yeah. But, David Purley's advantage was that he was wearing a flameproof suit and the marshals weren't.
Extraordinary.
And then in 1976, in the months preceding the German Grand Prix that we're going to be talking about, 3 drivers had been killed in accidents on the Nordschleife in lower categories of racing. So Niki argued that it was impossible to adequately marshal a track as long as the Nürburgring, which needed 5 times the number of marshals of a normal track, and they needed to be properly equipped to fight fires and remove drivers from the wrecks. And they needed effective medical support as well, which they also didn't have. In 1976, there was nothing of that. So immediately before the Grand Prix, Niki gave an interview to Autosport in which he said that at any other circuit, if you had a big crash, you had a 70-30 chance of surviving. At the ring, in his words, it was 100% death.
Very typically Lauda.
I should have done the impersonation. 100% death!
Yes.
And he spoke some extremely prophetic words to the Swiss magazine Powerslide. He said, "I dread the weekend. The important thing is to get through the weekend alive, in my opinion. If nothing happens, it will be a miracle."
Wow, very prophetic. And as we know, there would be no such miracle. Lauda qualified his Ferrari second behind McLaren's James Hunt, who took the pole. And, by the way, Hunt was in agreement with Lauda. Hunt, too, thought the Nürburgring was too dangerous, and he, too, had voiced his opposition to the race taking place. Yes, like Niki, James would have liked the Nürburgring race to have been abandoned. Yet, also like Niki, he was super quick there. They qualified first and second. After qualifying, James said, "I'm frightened, I don't mind telling you. I'm glad to see the finish line every lap." Richard, in my view, courage isn't the absence of fear in dangerous situations. That's foolhardiness. No, courage is overcoming real and justified fear in dangerous situations. And at Nürburgring in 1976, both Lauda and Hunt did exactly that. Anyway, when the race started, the conditions were gloomy and parts of the circuit were underwater. Almost all the drivers, therefore, started on wet tyres, but Lauda was one of several to stop for slicks at the end of lap 1, in fact. And on lap 2, it happened. At the 130 miles an hour, 210 kilometres per hour left-hand kink before Bergwerk, the circuit's northernmost corner, Lauda's Ferrari 312 T2 suddenly twitched before snapping to the right. It went through the catch fencing, hit an earth bank, then bounced back onto the straight, now engulfed in flames, its left-hand fuel cell having been ripped off. Unable to take avoiding action, Brett Lunger ploughed his Surtees into the wreckage of Lauda's Ferrari, turning the fire into an inferno. To quote the then Autosport reporter, the great Nigel Roebuck, your friend and mine, Richard, it was a scene from Hades.
Yep. Lauda was trapped in his flaming car, and to make matters worse, his helmet had been ripped from his head in the initial impact, fracturing his cheekbone, so that his balaclava was all that was protecting his head. And to have your helmet ripped off in an accident is kind of unthinkable, isn't it? You know, that's what they're there for, to stay on. And it's interesting that he was wearing a helmet of a quite unusual design made by a French company called GPA. And And they didn't have chin straps, unlike all other helmets, unlike the Bell helmets and so on that other drivers wore. They had a rather unusual fastening. The bottom rim of the helmet actually hinged in two parts, one under the chin, the other under the back of the neck, operated by a button on the side of the helmet. I know this because I used one for a bit, partly because Niki and Gilles Villeneuve and one or two other heroes used them. And they were very nice. They were nice to wear, very comfortable. But there was a theory in Niki's case that the shock of this crash was so great that his skull contracted momentarily, fractionally, during the impact, and the helmet just that was enough for the helmet to fly off because there was no chin strap holding it on.
What an extraordinary thing. I mean, it would have been a terrible accident anyway.
Yeah.
But made even more terrible by that detail.
So there he was lying in the car, which was in flames. And Guy Edwards, another driver who'd managed to avoid Niki's Ferrari, and Harold Ertl, who'd hit Brett Lunger's car, joined Lunger in trying to get Lauda out of his car. And they were joined by Arturo Merzario, who'd stopped his Wolf Williams on the track nearby.
Just to press pause there for a second, Harold Ertl, Formula One driver and journalist. Can you imagine that now? He wrote, didn't he write for Automotor and Sport?
And aren't we supposed to refer to him as bearded Harold Ertl?
And mustachio.
And mustachio.
Yes.
Right,
but imagine a journalist who works for the race. Imagine any of them. I will finish my news story, but I'll just have to do qualifying at Monaco first. Then I'll finish the news story. Don't worry, boys.
Yeah, it just shows there's nothing to it, really. Can't be. Anyway, back to this terrible accident. There wasn't any time for the drivers who were trying to get Niki out to worry about possible neck or spinal injuries. They just had to get him out. And they couldn't rely on the marshals, just as Niki had feared. In the end, it was Merzario, who was actually an ex-Ferrari driver, who put his hands into the fire to release the buckle of Lauda's 6-point harness. And here's what Merzario said later. It wasn't easy because Niki was obviously in agony and straining hard against the belts, trying to get away from the flames. Thank God he eventually lost consciousness. It was only when his body relaxed that I could free the buckle.
My goodness, what a quote.
Extraordinary. And John Watson, who'd also stopped his Penske at this point, helped move Lauda clear of the car and cradled his head on his knees. What he said, it was clear that his head was badly burned, but it looked more like he was otherwise free of injuries. He'd regained consciousness, and he was actually talking. Emerson Fittipaldi had also stopped, and he and Lunger stripped off Lauda's charred overalls and ran their hands down either side of his body, trying to check for broken bones. They couldn't find any, but when they stood up and looked at each other, they saw that their overalls were stained with Lauda's blood. In fact, the potentially lethal damage was out of sight. Lauda's windpipe had been badly damaged and his blood poisoned from breathing in the toxic fumes from the burning fuel, the bodywork, and the fire extinguisher fluid. His lungs, in his words, had turned to shit. Soon he'd be in a critical condition.
He would indeed soon be in a critical condition, but later he learned and recognised that he'd been very lucky, actually, in terms of what happened next. The doctors at the first hospital he'd been taken to soon realised they couldn't treat him. It was too much. The injuries were too bad. So he was moved to another hospital in Ludwigshafen, quite a distance away, actually, where a senior doctor was on duty, which was very unusual on a Sunday in those days. That senior doctor recognised the specific care that Lauda required and arranged a transfer to another hospital, Universitätsklinikum, in other words, University Clinic, in Mannheim near Ludwigshafen, where there was a unit that specialised in treating lung trauma, and where there also happened to be a senior specialist working that Sunday. I mean, nowadays, of course, every Formula One circuit has its own medical centre with a helicopter on standby, ready to take drivers to appropriate hospitals if their injuries are too severe to be treated at the circuit. But almost 50 years ago, things were very, very different. So he was lucky in those two regards.
Yeah, he was very lucky. He said afterwards that, one of the obvious things to do to somebody in that condition might be to give them oxygen. The first nurse or doctor might have thought, oh, let's give him some oxygen. He said oxygen at that point, in the state that his lungs and his windpipe were in, oxygen would have killed him at that point. So there's another
stroke of luck.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, let's leave it there for part one. And when we come back, we'll discuss Niki's incredible recovery.
You saw that play when your all-star sized up the defender, jab stepped twice, then stepped back and drained one at the buzzer. That's not just hall-worthy, that's wall-worthy, and you can own a piece of it when you shop the unrivaled selection of trading cards and memorabilia on eBay, the home of collectibles since 1995. Squad up with 132 million users around the world to find that rookie patch auto you can't find anywhere else. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Plus, with eBay Authenticity Guarantee for trading cards, you know what you buy is the real deal. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's right. Your collecting journey tips off right here, right now at ebay.com/theathletic. Come through and collect with us today.
This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
College football is back like never before. I'm David Ubben, and I host Until Saturday, the Athletics Leveled Up College Football Podcast. 3 times a week, you'll hear me and my co-hosts, fellow Athletics senior writer Chris Vanini and 2-time national champion Damian Harris, embrace the sport's new madness with you. We're also just going to have a ton of fun enjoying all the things that make college football great. Check out the brand new Until Saturday, every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday this fall. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
When we left you before the break, Niki Lauda was lying in a hospital bed in Mannheim fighting for his life. His face and hands were horrifically burned, ranging from 1st to 3rd degree, and he'd lost most of his right ear, his eyebrows, and his eyelids. His lungs were barely functioning, burned by the poisonous fumes he'd inhaled from his Ferrari's burning bodywork, and the oxygen level in his blood was found, I remember reading at the time, to be lower than that considered necessary to sustain life. A vacuum pump was used to drain liquid from his lungs and to try to clear some of the infected tissue, which process Niki later described, by the way, as incredibly painful. I mean, I bet. At that point, he couldn't see, he couldn't speak, but he could hear. He later said that although his brain was still alert because he could think, he could feel that his body was giving up. On the Tuesday, so 2 days after the shunt, his doctors agreed that they did not expect him to live much longer. So a priest was called to give him the last rites, and that happened. And that was the turning point, wasn't it, Richard?
Yes, it was, and that's a very Niki Lauda story. He said later that a weak person would have responded to being given the last rites by just giving up and dying on the spot. Niki was not that weak person. And so he also had advice for priests. You shouldn't do that, he said. They should come in and say, "You're looking wonderful today," and give you some encouragement.
But he didn't need that, because he was Niki Lauda. And anyway, let's go on, because this is an extraordinary stage of the story. In his autobiography, which I'm sure you've read, Richard.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, yeah. Very, very good it is. Niki recounted having flashbacks, transported back to what had happened to him in the summer of 1976. He recalled the feeling of falling into a big black hole, somersaulting into a huge void. perhaps surprisingly, he described that as a beautiful feeling. He wrote that he remembered thinking that he couldn't give in to this beautiful feeling of slipping into this big black hole, and how hearing conversations between the doctors and his wife, his first wife, Marlena, helped him to will himself to stay alive. And gradually, thanks to the vacuum pumping and the multiple blood transfusions, and also thanks to his own sheer bloody-minded determination, his oxygen levels stabilized. The next day, the Wednesday, he could breathe unaided. And on the Thursday, and look, we're just talking about only 4 days after his terrible crash, and just 2 days after he had been given the last rites by a priest, the pipes were removed from his throat so that he could speak. And what's more, not only did he speak, but he got out of his hospital bed and instead sat up on a chair. And the next day, Friday, he began walking and talking. And what he was talking about was, can you guess? What he was talking about was not, am I going to live, or is my life going to be normal again, but when am I going to get back into a Formula One Ferrari and go racing again? Amazing. Absolutely astonishing.
Well, that's a Formula One driver for you.
Yeah.
And a very special one.
Yes.
And it was at this point that he had to deal with his other injuries, the visual ones. As well as the burns, his head and neck were swollen like a balloon. His eyes were just slits. And most of his right ear was missing, as we've said. After they'd stabilized his lungs and his breathing, there were painful skin grafts. The most radical was when the surgeons actually took skin from his thigh to graft onto his forehead. But his face would be forever disfigured. And in another person, that might completely transform their personality or wreck them psychologically. But Niki was incredibly strong-willed and resilient. He knew he looked bad, but he decided early on that he couldn't do anything about it. When he was in hospital, the newspapers speculated on how badly he'd been disfigured, and a photographer even broke into his hospital room to take photos. Bild, the German tabloid, ran a headline, "My God, where is his face?" And there was a follow-up, "Niki Lauda has survived, but how can a man exist without a face?" So people were being given these awful images of what he might look like if they ever saw him again.
Bild, not always the most sympathetic of reporting.
No, possibly not. And when he had reconstructive surgery to his face, he chose to limit it to replacing the eyelids and restoring their functionality, and not to worry about the rest of his appearance. But by this stage, as you say, Matt, incredibly, Niki had already started to focus on returning to racing. "Lying in bed ruminating about the ring would have finished me," he said. And there's a lot to be said about those in recovery having a goal to chase. It gave him a focus and a motivation to get better.
It did, but I don't think that many people have the inner resolve or inner reserves to do it in the way that Niki did, but I accept the point. It's certainly a goal gives you a focus. Anyway, it wasn't just Niki, because there were two other key people in his recovery. His first wife, Marlena, who we've mentioned, who Niki said showed fortitude that he didn't know could exist in a human being. And that's serious praise from someone like Niki.
Yeah, they hadn't been married very long, I think, at that point.
I think you're right.
So, he would have realized that for her, suddenly to have her perfectly normal, except for being a racing driver, husband transformed into this extraordinary looking, sort of, at the time, wreck of a human must have been shattering. But she bore it too.
She bore it and supported him.
Yeah.
So that was one of the two people. And the other one was a man called Willy Dungal. Now, Willy Dungal was a fitness guru who'd made his name working with the Austrian ski jumping team in the 1960s. And when Niki persuaded his doctors to let him continue his recovery at home, he was joined there by Willy Dungal. Dungal looked after every aspect of Lauda's recovery, from what he ate to how much exercise he did to how much rest he got, etc., etc. I remember reading in the motorsport press at the time about the legend that was Willy Dungal, All top-class sports stars have such people working with them nowadays, but 50 years ago, it was, well, if not unheard of, then certainly very, very rare. But it worked for Niki, because Willi prepared him not only physically, but also mentally, psychologically, emotionally, for his return to the cockpit. One of the tests he devised, to check whether or not his patient, Niki, was ready to race again, was that he rolled sheets of newspaper into balls, then set them alight, and threw them at Niki. He wanted to see if Niki could deal with that challenge rationally, or whether the sight and smell of a flaming ball being hurled at him would cause him to lose control.
Extraordinary.
Extraordinary. Not really scientific by today's standards.
But how brilliant.
Brilliant. And of course, Niki did indeed deal with the challenge rationally. And when he did that, Willi knew his patient was going to be okay.
Yes, and at this point, Niki was also being driven by anger. When he came home from hospital, he was shown footage of the accident taken by a teenage boy with an 8mm home movie camera. And it was clear when he saw it to Niki that something looked to have broken at the back of the car. So he was reassured that it wasn't his error, but he was also dismayed when Ferrari refused to rule out driver error. They actually said that the tyre marks on the track proved that there had been no mechanical failure.
Which is not actually proof.
It's not proof, no. But, I think they were. I mean, they didn't. They weren't very hard. The Audetto, the Ferrari team manager, wasn't very hard line about it. He was just kind of speculating.
Audetto, yes.
Just speculating on possible causes. But they certainly didn't rule out driver error. And of course, that didn't help the relationship between the driver and the team, which was a bit of a strange relationship anyway, a bit like Ferrari's with Fangio, his champion in 1956, you'll remember. Enzo Ferrari didn't like Fangio because he sent his business manager to negotiate his contract rather than just accept whatever Ferrari happened to offer. The old man claimed that he distrusted Niki because he wouldn't look him in the eye. He called him a great and intelligent driver in his memoirs and admired his professional approach to the job, but you could tell he didn't love him in the way that he'd once loved Tazio Nuvolari and would later love Gilles Villeneuve. Yes, he wins, Enzo Ferrari said of Niki, but he races like an accountant. He's cold. It's never thrilling. Well, don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know about that either. But look, we're talking about another very unusual man, Enzo Ferrari.
A very unusual man, yes, who'd been a racing driver himself. But, Niki had helped drag that team up from a pretty bad state, so he could have been a bit more generous.
He could.
The Italian press, who were usually on Ferrari's side, had already criticised Niki personally earlier in the season after he was injured when he overturned a farm tractor and cracked some ribs. And now, in his absence, they were campaigning for a young Italian called Maurizio Flamini. You probably remember him, Matt.
Yes, but he hasn't really become a global superstar.
No, he was doing quite well in Formula 2, but they wanted to stick him in Lauda's seat in the Scuderia Ferrari.
Yeah.
Enzo wasn't having that, but he did start looking for a replacement. And immediately after the accident, he told Daniele Audetto, the team manager, to contact Emerson Fittipaldi, who declined the offer.
Do you know why he refused the offer?
Well, one factor may have been that he and Niki were very good friends, and he didn't want to take his
Which they certainly were.
Yeah, and he didn't want to take his friend's seat in a time of distress. But the other would have been, apparently he said to Audetto, Ferrari, said that if he took a seat at Ferrari and left Copersucar, his Brazilian team, he'd get killed at home.
Wow. Because it was the first year of Copersucar. Well, the first year that Emerson was driving
that's right,
with his brother Wilson.
That's right. And it was their project.
Yes.
So there we are. Enzo Ferrari then told Audetto to contact Ronnie Peterson, who was Niki's old March teammate, and arrangements were made for Peterson to test a Ferrari at Fiorano. Fittipaldi told Lauda about that one, and Niki hit the roof, and Peterson's test was promptly cancelled.
It's one of those what might have been, because, Peterson in a flat 12 Ferrari in the late 70s, he might have been very successful.
Yeah, well, he'd already raced the 312Ps, the Ferrari, which had that flat 12 engine, was also sports car, in endurance racing very successfully. Anyway, Niki was furious at what he saw as, at best, a lack of faith in his ability to recover, and at worst, as a betrayal. He wrote, "What I really needed from the team was a sense of composure, a feeling of continuity and trust." Well, he didn't get it. So, Matt, was he entitled to feel aggrieved? Or were Ferrari, who'd just assumed, like everyone else, that Lauda would never race again, simply reacting to the situation in the best way they could? I'd say it was the right decision. The old man had a team to run.
Yes. I mean, look, hindsight is a great thing. At that time, if anyone had said that they expected Niki Lauda to race in the Italian Grand Prix, the 1976 Italian Grand Prix, and to score points in it, they'd have been laughed at. You'd have been called mad. And yes, Enzo Ferrari had a Formula One team to run and a Formula One World Championship to win, which his cars were, one driver was leading and his cars were leading the constructors. And James Hunt and McLaren were going great guns, of course, while Niki was in hospital. And you don't defend a slim World Championship points lead with only one driver, especially as that one driver, Clay Regazzoni, Niki's teammate, was occasionally very good, but too often mediocre. And simply wasn't in the same class as either Lauda or Hunt.
Yeah, a perfect number two.
Yes.
Yeah, good on his day, could sort of step in when necessary.
Rather like Hunt's teammate Jochen Mass, actually, at the time.
And loved by the team and the fans.
Exactly. And by the journalists and held in high regard now, by those who love Formula One history and motor racing history. Anyway, so Ferrari ended up signing Carlos Reutemann, whom I mentioned in passing half an hour or so ago. Now, Reutemann had won Grand Prix for Bernie Ecclestone's Brabham team in 1974 and 1975, and he'd marked himself out as a star in so doing. But in 1976, he was struggling in a Brabham, not powered by the Cosworth, which had powered the cars in 74 and 75 that he'd had success in, but by the then heavy and then unreliable Alfa Romeo flat 12 engine, and Carlos was looking for a way out. Carlos, moody, often introspective, wasn't enjoying it at Brabham. So when the offer came from Ferrari, he jumped at the chance. He didn't even finish the season at Brabham. His last race for the team was Zandvoort. I think you were looking to say something about Carlos Reutemann, knowing very well, Richard, that he's my childhood hero.
Yeah, well, I think Carlos Reutemann looked more like a Ferrari Grand Prix driver than any man who ever lived.
Yes.
I always remember going to the Monaco Grand Prix in, I think, 73 and reading the program notes in French. And, they were going through little profiles of the drivers. They got to Reutemann and the description was physique du séducteur du cinéma. The look of a matinee idol, in other words, and that's what he was. I mean, he just looked like that, didn't he? If he'd been a bit less moody, he would have been one of the greatest drivers who ever lived. But anyway, he seemed a real natural fit for Ferrari in that respect.
Yes, that matinee idol point is made often by, again, Nigel Roebuck, who always called him the racing driver from Central Casting.
That's absolutely right.
It's a very Roebuck phrase. Anyway, Lauda was incensed when he heard that Reutemann had been signed. But, and this is interesting, I think, paradoxically, Niki being Niki, Carlos's arrival actually served as motivation for him. He decided that he was absolutely determined to return at all costs, and sooner rather than later. So, yes, Reutemann's arrival actually hastened Lauda's return. I mean, Niki had originally been aiming to come back for the Canadian Grand Prix at Mosport in early October, but spurred on to accelerate his recuperation by the spectre of Reutemann taking over his car, he vowed to make his comeback at Monza instead. I don't think he wanted Reutemann driving his car without him there as well. Enzo Ferrari, nonetheless, felt he needed proof that such a sudden return for Niki wasn't absolute madness, so he demanded that Lauda show that he was not only fit enough, but also fast enough, two different things. So, and let's just remember, this is only, even now, 38 days after his Nurburgring accident. He, Niki, reported to Maranello, by the way, having flown himself in his own jet to Bologna Airport. Anyway, Aldetto, the team manager, remembers that greeting Lauda was like seeing a ghost. Because Niki was wearing head bandage, encrusted with blood. He couldn't close his eyes, remember? His race suit was very baggy because, although he and Villidungal had been training together in a gym, he'd still lost a hell of a lot of weight. But even so, despite all of that, Niki climbed into his car and drove 60 laps at Fiorano. Okay, not a long circuit, so perhaps 40 laps of a longer circuit, but still a proper stint, 60 laps. And by the end, he was getting close to the lap record. And you can just imagine him thinking, I am going to show them. So Ferrari had no choice, really, but to reluctantly agree to enter a third car for Monza. So he had Regazzoni, Reutemann, and now Lauda. And actually, Lauda insisted on it, reminding Ferrari and Aldetto that he had a contract which there was now no earthly reason why they shouldn't honour. He was in. He was back.
And in a three-car team, which of course is another difference between today and 50 years ago. Then if you wanted to enter three cars or four or five or six, all you had to do was square it with Bernie. And, since it was Ferrari, he would have done it.
Well, I can imagine Bernie's not going to say no to another Ferrari at Monza.
Absolutely not.
No.
And that feels like a good time for our final ad break.
This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC. This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
So it was official. Niki Lauda was to make a remarkable comeback at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Friday practice would take place just 40 days after his monumental accident at the Nurburgring. So, Richard, do you think that would be allowed today? After all, he still had head wounds that weren't fully healed.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Villidungal had got his body back to pretty well full fitness so that he could run and he could do strenuous gym sessions. But his tear ducts were damaged and he couldn't blink properly, which, wouldn't be much of a help if you were trying to drive a Grand Prix car.
Absolutely.
He was in serious pain when the skin grafts rubbed against his balaclava and his helmet lining. But those were different times. What doesn't change is the racing driver's powers of recovery. And, you can think back to 1933 when Rudy Caracciolo smashed his leg at Monaco and was back 12 months later and took the 1935 European Championships, then the equivalent of the World Championship, with the right leg 2 inches shorter than the left. And there's Sterling Moss in 1960 breaking both his legs and crushing 3 vertebrae in a crash at Spa and then racing in a Grand Prix 8 weeks later. But in terms of physical recovery, I think Niki's comeback at Monza was probably the most remarkable of the lot.
Probably it was, yeah. Anyway, between Nürburgring and Monza, as I say, Formula One had of course been continuing. In Lauda's absence, Ferrari didn't take part in the Austrian Grand Prix at the Österreichring, which was won, by the way, by John Watson, then and now Penske's sole Formula One Grand Prix victory. And here's an anorak fact. I mean, the Penske stat is an anorak fact, but here's another one. The 1976 Austrian Grand Prix is the most recent round of the Formula One World Championship in which Scuderia Ferrari has taken no part. Did you know that? You probably did. I think you
Maybe.
did. I think you did. Officially, the decision to miss the race was described by the team as a mark of respect for Lauda. I can imagine Lauda saying, "Total bullshit." and I don't believe that for a minute. Rather, most people, even at the time, most people thought it was a cynical move on Enzo Ferrari's part to try to get the race cancelled, to limit McLaren's and Hunt's chances of closing the gap in the World Championship chase.
I also think it was a protest, wasn't it? Ferrari were protesting against what had happened in Spain earlier in the season when the Hunt's McLaren had been disqualified for having a wing that was too wide. And then was reinstated. And that's what, Ferrari said that's what they were protesting against by not...
Enzo Ferrari had the hump about that, of course.
Certainly.
Anyway, Lauda, believe it or not, had only missed 2 Grand Prix, the Austrian and the Dutch. The Austrian was won by Watson in the Penske, and the Dutch was won by Hunt in the McLaren, brilliantly, I may say so. So James was catching Niki in the Drivers' World Championship standings, but even so, far from feeling supported by Ferrari as he battled against the odds to defend his World Championship lead, Lauda felt almost tormented by the team. Indeed, he reckoned the Monza organisers were going out of their way to make things difficult for him. For example, he was forced to take an extra medical on the Thursday at Monza, and he suspected the influence of Enzo Ferrari there. Richard, you know more about Enzo Ferrari than I do by some margin. Was that just paranoia on Niki's part, or do you recognise the sometimes malevolent touch of the old man?
I'm not sure malevolence is the right word, Matt, but the old man always liked to feel that he was in complete control of the team, of the drivers as well as the cars. And he'd probably have preferred to be racing at Monza with just Reutemann and Regazzoni and without the distraction of Lauda's return to action. But I'd also say, I think, the Monza authorities were perfectly within their rights to insist, given the circumstances, that Lauda had an extra medical examination. This is a bloke who couldn't blink his eyelids.
Yeah, I guess. I'm always looking for undercurrents, and there were always undercurrents.
There were.
Yeah,
especially with Ferrari.
And let's not forget, it wasn't only a physical issue for Lauda. He was appearing in public for the first time, so he had to deal psychologically, mentally, emotionally, with the morbid curiosity of the tifosi, who wanted to stare at his injuries and disfigurements, and certainly had no hesitation in doing so when they saw him.
Well, let's face it, most people like staring at injuries and disfigurements, and it's not just the tifosi.
No, I guess. Anyway, Niki gave a great quote about that to David Benson, the journalist at the Daily Express at the time. He said, "A lot of people say I'm crazy to go back to racing so quickly." "Are you nuts?" he probably said. "A lot of people say I'm crazy to go back to racing so quickly. They say that a man with a face that's not like that of a human being, but like a dead man's skull, should give up. People who think like that would probably be very happy to be ill and to stay at home and not to have to go out to work. That's not my attitude to life. I can't enjoy life unless I'm active, unless I have something to do and look forward to. I must work." That sums up Niki's attitude, doesn't it, Richard?
Yes, it does. And what it showed, as you suggested earlier, Matt, is that how sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to acknowledge being scared and to face it, to deal with it, and to overcome it.
Yeah, exactly.
And, Niki could be forgiven for being a bit cynical. The only person to interview him before the race at Monza was Ian Wooldridge of the Daily Mail, who found out where he was staying in a small hotel with his wife, trying to keep out of the way, but Wooldridge found his way there. And he confronted Niki outside the hotel and said, "Can I interview you, Mr. Lauda?" And Lauda said, "You have 2 minutes."
Yes.
So he did. And Wooldridge wrote a very Wooldridgian piece afterwards, very good. But he did say it was like interviewing a fried chicken.
Wow.
Which is not very charming.
He didn't write that, did he?
He did. He wrote it. It was in the paper.
He wrote it in the
He
mail.
was describing his injuries. He said
Yeah.
it was like interviewing a fried chicken.
Wow. Yeah.
Anyway, back to the track. And on the first day of practice, it rained. Not good news. That was the last thing Niki needed. And he admitted quite candidly in his autobiography that he was rigid with fear and did as few laps as possible, and not very quickly. And at the end of day one, he was 19th and slowest of the 3 Ferraris behind Reutemann and Regazzoni, which would not have gone unnoticed at Maranello.
No, certainly.
And there's a great section in the autobiography where he talks about it. He said, "I'd employed my standard tactics, objective review of emotions, establish causes, dismiss any illogical or irrelevant items, and I was well primed mentally. I'd also shrugged off the Nurburgring shunt, or at least I thought I had. I said to myself, you could drive before, so you can do it exactly the same way now. And since nothing has changed, there's nothing to be worried about." Great, but in the event, it didn't work out that way. When I climbed into the cockpit at Monza, fear hit me so hard that all my self-motivation theories flew out the window. Diarrhea, heart pounding, throwing up. I made it back to the peace and quiet of the hotel and went over the situation in my mind, trying to identify what I'd done wrong. Well, Lauda decided that what he'd done wrong was attempt to drive as fast as before. So the next day he put himself under less pressure. He decided to start off by driving more slowly and build up speed. He ended up 5th, the fastest of all the Ferraris, a truly incredible feat in the circumstances.
Absolutely incredible. I mean, that quote in the autobiography about, diarrhea, heart pounding, throwing up, a man in extremis, in crisis.
Yeah.
And yet he managed to rise above it somehow.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was other good things going on for Lauda in that sense, because his great rival Hunt, who'd been dominating and has been pole position after pole position and a lot of race wins, qualified only 9th before having his time deleted, even that 9th best time deleted, causing him to be sent to the back of the grid for so-called fuel irregularities. But let's be clear. I mean, maybe you're going to accuse me of cynicism here, but let me just lay it out as I see it. This was Monza in the 1970s, and Ferrari were in trouble. So can we really accept at face value that the two teams that had won the last 2 Grand Prix, Penske at the Österreichring and McLaren at Zandvoort, were suddenly and mysteriously the only 2 teams whose fuel, when tested, gave octane readings above the permitted rating? I don't think so.
You are an old cynic. The findings of those surveys are on the public record. You can go and read them.
Listen to this bit. And this is, by the way, yet another anorak fact, I think. 2 weeks after the teams had departed Monza, the FIA, or to be absolutely pedantic, the CSI, which was then a subcommittee of the FIA, sheepishly admitted that its methods of analysing fuel were inadequate.
Oh, okay. Bang to rights.
Bang to rights. And to be frank, the teams had suspected that much at the time. Indeed, the only reason why, as far as I understand it, the only reason or the main reason or one of the reasons why McLaren and Penske hadn't protested the Monza organisers' decision to relegate their cars to the back of the grid was so as not to embarrass their fuel suppliers and sponsors, Texaco in McLaren's case and Sunoco in Penske's. I mean, already Formula One was quite a commercial operation.
But you could use whatever petrol you wanted.
Yes.
As long as the rule at the time was the octane rating had to be within the range sold at pumps in the country the Grand Prix was taking place in.
There you are.
I mean, there's a rule for you.
What a rule. What a rule. Anyway, the upshot was that Hunt started the 1976 Italian Grand Prix in 24th place, his McLaren teammate Maas in 25th place, and Penske's Watson in 26th place. Just imagine, Richard, how today's keyboard warriors would react on social media to that unholy shambles if it were happened today. What do you reckon?
I think it would be wonderful, actually. The bonfire of the social media. It would be great. Anyway, despite his heroics in qualifying, it still wasn't known by anybody whether Lauda could handle the rigours of a full Grand Prix distance, which meant 52 laps of Monza, 187 miles or 301 kilometres. The weather on race day was grey, but luckily it was dry. Lauda was received by the fans as he made his way to the grid with an extraordinary display of respect. I read a description by someone who said he wasn't cheered, he was applauded by the entire 80,000.
Interesting nuance of difference.
Very, yes.
Yeah.
It was admiration and respect. While poor old James Hunt was booed and whistled, as you have to expect if you're a rival of Ferrari and you're turning up at Monza. But then Niki made a terrible start for an extraordinary reason. He wasn't aware, nobody at Ferrari had told him, so he claimed, that the starting system had been changed. It was the big change in Formula One starts in the modern era, from the dropping of the national flag following a 10-second a board that told you there were 10 seconds to go, to the lights, green then red, the sort of thing we have today, 50 years later. Anyway, amazing. Niki didn't know that. He took the start without it. And he said, I wasn't even in gear when these lights did their thing. So he dropped straight down to 12th. And that put him in heavy traffic in the midfield. And he admitted later to being scared again by that. But he settled down and gradually, well, quite quickly actually, he climbed the order. 10th on lap 3, 8th on lap 7, 6th on lap 14. And at the end of the race, after an hour and a half, he swept across the finish line in 4th place, and the Tifosi were beside themselves with joy. Ronnie Peterson won, and Clay Regazzoni, Niki's teammate, was second, but Lauda was the story, and the whole of the story. Reutemann was only 9th. Hunt retired from the race, but he was extremely magnanimous afterwards towards his chief rival. This is what he said. Niki's race really spoke for itself. To virtually step out of the grave and 6 weeks later come 4th in a Grand Prix was an amazing achievement.
Yes. Let's be clear. Lauda's performance at Monza in 1976 was, and remains, one of the greatest in Formula One history. That's my view. I rate it that highly. He'd been at death's door only a few weeks before. No one had given him an earthly chance of making it back as early as Monza. As recently, as a fortnight before, he duly did make it back to Monza. Yet he qualified, as you say, Richard, he qualified 5th, ahead of his two teammates, Reutemann 7th and Regazzoni 9th, and, in pain, he raced to 4th. Now, if you'll let me, I'm going to read you the last paragraph of Pete Lyons' autocourse race report. And the reason I'm going to read it is that it's, in my view, almost mesmerisingly good.
Typical of Lyons, who was a wonderful writer. A wonderful observer of the Formula One scene.
Lyrical, beautiful prose, as you will hear. Now, in previous paragraphs, Lyons had written critically, I'm talking about in previous paragraphs of the same report, he'd written critically of the way the organisers had nobbled McLaren and Penske, and how the general vibe at Monza had therefore become unpleasant, exacerbated by the jeering tifosi. Yet now, as the end of the race drew near and it became clear that Ronnie Peterson, whom everyone loved, was going to win it for March, his only win for March, despite, by the way, lurid oversteer that Ronnie, Super Swede, was controlling as only he could, the mood changed. So that's the background and the lead up to Lyons' final paragraph, and this is how he described it. This is how he wrote it. So it goes like this. A quarter of a minute behind Ronnie Peterson, there was another man coping even more magnificently. Yet now Niki Lauda, for it was he, saw the needle on his oil gauge dropping. 3 laps from the end, the young man, who was but 6 weeks past seeing a priest give him the last rites, had the fastest lap of the race on the official clocks. It was only then that Peterson, finally, took that from him. But nothing that Jody Scheckter, in 5th, could do was going to take 4th place from him. And, although his slackening Ferrari was only 1/10 of a second to the good at the checkered flag, it was as good as need be. It was said later that when Niki took off his helmet in the pits after the race, his balaclava was soaked in blood where his part-healed burns had opened up. As the first of the fence-jumping crowd met the last of the pits-bound cars, the Autodromo Nazionale di Monza was filled with a completely different atmosphere. Something had been released, discharged amidst the thunder of one of the very best races seen in a very troubled year. The derisory banners were still there, and they were still waving furiously, but the bite had gone out of their message. From a number of standpoints, the right man, no, the right men, had won. I mean, Richard, isn't that great?
Fabulous.
Fabulous. And by the way, brilliant writer, as you say, Pete Lyons.
For an American, too.
Yes, but really stirring stuff, wasn't it? Stirring stuff. Difficult to read with dry eyes, if I'm really honest. Anyway, do you think any other driver, before or since, would have been able to do what Lauda did at Monza in 1976?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, and I would say maybe Tazio Nuvolari.
Yes,
who
possibly.
sometimes finished races towards the end of his career coughing blood,
yes.
And tried to finish races in cars which the wheels had fallen off.
Yes.
I mean, it's just amazing. And once came into the pits waving the steering wheel.
Detached.
Because that had come off.
Yes.
I mean,
there's a great photograph of that, actually.
Fabulous.
Yes.
So maybe Nuvolari, but it is, what Lauda did was unique. And I think, what had a great deal to do with it was his unusual powers of self-examination. And some would call his approach calculating, and others would call it clever. We can probably all think of 1 or 2 great champions who also had an objective attitude to racing, might have been called calculating, and who'd have been too sensible to do what Niki did at Monza. What was special about him is that he let himself override what his own objectivity was telling him and behave like the sort of driver who's motivated by passion and glory, the sort of driver Enzo Ferrari thought Lauda wasn't.
Well put. He wasn't that robotic computer. He was made of flesh and blood.
Yep, he just did have that fantastic capacity also to work things out.
Exactly. Anyway, he would not go on to win that year's World Championship. Hunt won the 2 North American races, Mosport in Canada and Watkins Glen in the United States, quite brilliantly, by the way, to his credit. Lauda was only 8th at Mosport, dropping from 5th when a rear suspension link worked loose near the end, but he managed 3rd at the Glen. And then came Fuji, which probably deserves a podcast of its own. Anyway, suffice to say that in absolutely torrential rain, 4 drivers withdrew in the opening laps, considering the standing water, with the grave risk of aquaplaning it presented, a hazard too far. The 4 were Larry Perkins, Carlos Pace, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Niki Lauda. In withdrawing, with James Hunt leading, Lauda knew that he was probably giving the World Championship away. But here was a man who had come too close to death too recently to risk it again over something as trifling as, a sporting bauble. And moreover, he would win it twice more. The next year in 1977, and, again, having apparently retired and come back in 1984, making 3 World Championships in all. Richard, I'm going to ask you, can you think of a sporting comeback greater than Lauda's twin sporting comebacks? The first from his deathbed to Monza, and the second from retirement to yet more World Championship glory.
Yeah, maybe the second one. The first, the deathbed one, is harder to find a parallel.
Yeah.
I think of Muhammad Ali stripped of his World Heavyweight Championship and losing 4 years of his career simply for refusing to fight in Vietnam, and then coming back to regain his title by knocking out George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle. And that was pretty good, wasn't it, as comebacks go?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
No deathbeds, but a great comeback. And then Tiger Woods enduring endless bouts of back surgery, awful, before returning to win his first major for 11 years at the 2019 US Masters. But again, not quite the same drama as the sight of a disfigured Lauda in a bloodied balaclava.
When we're talking about comebacks, we should probably mention Mike Hailwood in the TT.
Oh, goodness, yes, I'm sure that's right.
That was a serious comeback as well.
Yeah,
anyway,
it was.
We could be here all day talking about comebacks.
Yep. And before we wrap up, we should probably talk about the lasting consequences of Niki's crash and his comeback. The 14-mile Nordschleife was never raced on in F1 again, much to the regret of many fans, including this one, I have to say, and perhaps even one or two drivers. Lauda's relationship with Ferrari was damaged beyond repair. He stayed on in 1977 and won a second championship, but he was booed at Monza by the same Italian fans who'd applauded him the year before, because they knew already by then he'd be leaving for Bernie Ecclestone's Brabham team in 1978.
Yeah.
Matt, do you think Lauda was the same driver after the crash?
I think he was different, but just as good. He played the percentage game. Put it this way. In my long career, not quite as long as yours, dear boy, but in my long career, in which I've attended hundreds of Formula One Grand Prix and watched hundreds more on TV, as of course you have too, I don't think I've ever seen a driver who was better able to judge when to drive absolutely flat out with zero margin and when, instead, a steady run would net as near as, damn it, just as many World Championship points as driving absolutely flat out would. And by the way, if anybody's thinking that I didn't watch Lauda, I did. In fact, the very first Grand Prix I ever went to was Brands Hatch 1974, which he led, but didn't win. Jody Scheckter won. Anyway, as a result, Niki began to eliminate mistakes brilliantly. No, in the latter part of his career, he didn't always put his car on the pole. But by flagfall, he was almost always near the front or thereabouts. In fact, I think Alan Prost learned a lot from him in that regard when they were McLaren teammates.
And Niki just beat him to a title.
Exactly.
By being clever.
In 84, yes. But Le Professeur, as Alan Prost became known, perhaps learned some of that professorish stuff from Lauda.
I'm sure that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, even so, when Niki really wanted to, or if he felt doing so would net a reward that justified the risk, he could still show everyone just how damn quick he was. I'm thinking of his second place at Monaco in 1978 in a Brabham Alpha, charging back through the field from sixth after a late, unscheduled pit stop. His fastest race lap was faster that day than his quali lap the day before had been, and it was 2 seconds quicker, 2 seconds at Monaco, 2 seconds quicker than anyone else's fastest race lap. Not a bad anorak fact to finish on, is it?
2 seconds at Monaco.
I know.
Amazing. Anyway, that feels like the perfect time to say, and colossally, that's history. Thanks for joining us for this episode. We really hoped you enjoyed listening to it as much as we enjoyed making it.
Absolutely. And if you'd like to share your thoughts on Niki Lauda's Monza comeback and where it fits into the sporting pantheon, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us on podcasts@the-race.com or via social media, and I'm at the Bish F1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
And remember, if you'd like to listen to these episodes ad-free, why not join the Race Members Club? You can find the details in the description of this episode.
And before we sign off, I'm once again duty-bound to remind you that we also now have some And Colossally That's History merchandise, merch, I gather it's called, available to buy from the race shop. So if you want to let the world know about your taste in podcasts and support us on the show at the same time, why not buy yourself a t-shirt or a notebook? Again, there's a link in the description.
We'll be back again next week to re-examine another slice of motorsport history. But until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And philosophy, that's history.
The Athletic.
Did you know users searched football on eBay.com last season 12,000 times per hour? That's some serious searching. eBay has been the home of collectibles since 1995 and is the largest online marketplace for trading cards. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Come through and collect with us today.